Welcome to Perspectives on Islam. My name is Elaine, and today we're going to talk about Islam unveiling the mystery. Everybody loves a good mystery, right? We'll start by defining some of the terms used to describe veiling. The burqa is a full body piece, as you see here, with a mesh screen for the eyes. The chador is full body, but does not include the face. The niqab is a veil that covers the face, showing only the eyes. And the hijab is usually a headscarf, but is also veiling in general. It can be a curtain that's hung indoors, so a woman can speak to a man without him seeing her. And throughout this presentation, I will refer to the primary doctrine, the Quran, which is supposed to be the words of Allah, the Hadith, which are the stories and traditions about Muhammad, and the life story of Muhammad, to put everything in context, because the Quran is not in chronological order and neither are the Hadiths. So one needs to know the life of Muhammad to understand what happened when. Now, from Sharia, it states what the lawgiver, being Muhammad or Allah, say is what determines the acts of those who are morally responsible. The measure of good and bad is sacred law, Sharia, not reason. And Sharia is all the direction that is provided through the Sunnah of Muhammad, the traditions and stories about him, and the Quran. And this is merely a compendium, a handy reference for a few of the well-known things. It also says in the Sharia or in the Hadith, whoever obeys me, Muhammad, obeys God, and whoever disobeys Muhammad disobeys God. So they're on pretty much an equal footing when it comes to being obeyed. So when we think about veiling, a lot of people think of Arabian Nights. It's a wonderful mystery, an interesting story with beautiful women in harems. And how the story goes, this was first published in England in the 18th century, when people had a lot of curiosity about Arabia because it was a big white spot on the map that not too many people knew very much about. Well, the fairy tale is that the king had been betrayed by his wife. He killed her, and then he swore to marry every virgin in the country, but to kill her the next day. And the Grand Vizier's daughter, Scheherazade, is a storyteller, and she decides to marry the king in spite of her father's protests. And every night she begins a tale with the king, but she doesn't finish it. She leaves him hanging. And so night after night, the stories go on until finally, after 1,001 nights, the king decides he doesn't want to kill her. He's going to marry her. So this could seem romantic, except when you think really that it is a tale of a very brave and intelligent woman who saved the lives of hundreds of innocent virgins who could have died otherwise. But nevertheless, this is only a fairy tale. In the 19th century, spurred on by the mystery, a lot of English people were wanting to know more about it and going to Egypt if they could. And this is a very unusual situation. A very well-off family, Sophia Poole, her brother went to Cairo quite often, and he brought her with him. And because of her status, she was able to get into, and her sex, being a woman, she could get into some of the very higher echelon harems to see what they were really like. And she wrote, the ideas entertained by many in Europe of the immorality of the harem are, I believe, erroneous. That a deviation from the strictest rule of modesty is followed by severe punishment, and often by the death of the delinquent. So very precarious existence in a harem. Those girls were slaves. And in fact, there were crowds of white slaves serving them directly, also Black eunuchs and Black female slaves as well. She said the women of the inferior classes wear a black face veil rather than a white one. And sometimes it is decorated with coins and beads. They draw a part of the head veil before the face and leave only one eye visible. And this is how she dressed herself if she went outside. So now, not the fairy tale, today in Iran, there are enforcers. And as you see here, the most prevalent form of state-sponsored violence against women is Iran's compulsory veiling. And there was a proposed bill to increase the age of marriage for girls to 16 under the pretext that it contained religious and social deficiencies. It was defeated. It contradicted the teachings of Islam. So girls there and in Afghanistan and elsewhere are sometimes married by the age of 9. And the laws stipulate that girls as young as age 6 must cover their hair, and they are criminally accountable as early as age 9. This is the same in Afghanistan and is given as the reason that they may not attend school is because they're of marriageable age. In Iran, there are 27 government agencies empowered to enforce the compulsory veil. That the hijab enforcement has extended to organized acid attacks now, and women being stabbed by members of extrajudicial groups. The regime's failure to prosecute these criminals has only emboldened them, and acid attacks against women have become common. The 3 anti-hijab women activists were sentenced to 55 years and 6 months for failing to wear the hijab. So where did all these captives and slaves come from that we were reading about in the 19th century? And by the way, there are still many slaves today. They estimate 130,000 in Nigeria alone. But it says, after migration, so for the first 13 years, Muhammad was in Mecca. He was married to one woman. There was no compulsory veiling. But after the migration to Medina, things changed quite a lot. That is when Muhammad adopted jihad, and they took captives, slaves, and sometimes they ransomed them, sometimes they kept them. And the men who followed him, they were allowed to have these slaves because they were called what your right hand possesses. So those and their wives. And it says as it says in the Quran, that for his followers, forbidden ordinarily are women who are married, except captives and slaves. Whether they're married or not doesn't matter, that his followers are free to have intercourse with them. And captives were usually enslaved, but not always. Here's an example of Sophia. She's an extraordinarily beautiful woman. Her husband had just been killed, and this is near Khaybar. And Muhammad decided to make her his wife, as you can see, because she was ordered to use a veil. And the Quran says the spoils of war belong to Allah and Muhammad. And again, Muhammad chose to marry Rihanna, but she was Jewish. She did not want to put on the veil. And she had shown repugnance towards Islam and wanted to remain a Jew. So the apostle, Muhammad, put her aside and felt some displeasure. Not long after that, though, someone came to tell Muhammad that she had changed her mind, and this gave him pleasure. And this isn't what always happened, though. Here are the followers saying, we want ransom, but we want to have sex with the girls, and we're not sure what to do. Should we withdraw the penis so that they don't get pregnant? And Muhammad said, no, you can do whatever you like. It doesn't matter. If a child is to be born, it's to be born. So they could have sex with the captives and ransom them or whatever they pleased. So enjoy what you have gotten in booty in war, lawful and good, says the Quran. So this isn't much like the fairy tale. The veils were not compulsory at first, just like today. As his wife Aisha says, he used to see me before the veil was prescribed. The veil had not yet been ordered. This being before the veil was imposed on them, before the veil was imposed on us, before the veil was prescribed for women. Now, Aisha had been in Medina for a number of years. So when did this happen exactly? Well, it turns out this was around 5 years after the migration to Medina. And how did this come about after all this time? Because Muhammad had now been preaching for 18 years, and the veil had not been compulsory until now. Well, it seems here, as you see in this hadith, that his companion Umar used to say to Muhammad, "Let your wives be veiled." And Allah's apostle, Muhammad, did not want to do this. But one night, Umar saw one of his wives out at night relieving herself. She was quite tall, so he was able to identify her, and he went to Muhammad and he said, "I saw your wife out last night. You need to have them covered." And so Muhammad had a revelation from Allah saying that wives needed to be covered. And the wives were not too happy, as you can see. Aisha here saying, "Why are you ordering the mothers of the believers to cover themselves?" Because Umar was quite pleased that Allah had agreed with him in 3 things, the veiling of women being one of them. So what happened was the Quran verse is saying that the women must be veiled, and Aisha protested. And that's when it was revealed again in the Quran that it may be if he divorces you all, that Allah will give him better wives than you. So the women understood that if they objected too much, they could be divorced. And at that time, that would have been incredibly difficult for them, and that they were required to be devoutly obedient because Allah could substitute better wives than them. So makeshift veils were acceptable when the verse came down, the verses 24-31. And if she doesn't have a veil, she should cover herself with the veil of her companion. Here they tore their dresses and covered their heads and faces with them. And as I said, this was revealed in Medina about 5 years after the migration. And it says that they are to not show off their adornment. They can only show the palms of their hands or one eye or both eyes for necessity to see. They were to draw their veils all over their bodies, faces, necks, and bosoms, and not display themselves as was the former times of ignorance. Now, again, I notice here the former time of ignorance, because we're talking 18 years of no veil being necessary. So it implies here that this was all a time of ignorance. And we do know that the earlier verses have been abrogated and replaced with later verses. So the veiling is an example of that. So here we go. Before the close family, they could be unveiled. Here's an example. His wife Sauda, there was a young boy in the room and she was told to veil herself. Age mattered. Muhammad said that Allah doesn't accept the prayer of a woman who has reached puberty unless she wears a veil. But for older women who could no longer have children, that they did not have to wear a veil. So there were additional restrictions on Muhammad's wives. One thing is they had responsibility. Women would quite often come to them with their problems because they were married to Muhammad. So this woman came, she'd been beaten. She was wearing a green veil and she complained to Aisha. And it was the woman's habit to support each other. And she said to Muhammad, "I've not seen any woman suffering as much as the believing women. Look, her skin is greener than her clothes." And again, we have the veiling here in the Quran. Muhammad said that people were not to enter his house and except when they are invited, and that when they ask his wives for anything, that they should ask from behind a screen, but also that his wives cannot marry after his death with Allah, that would be an enormity, like a very bad thing. So his wives would not be able to marry again, unlike other women. Now, because Muhammad had a number of wives, 12 wives after the migration to Medina, he took turns. And so he was supposed to have spent this night with Aisha, but he went out and Aisha followed him to find out what he was doing. She says, I covered my head and put on my veil. Well, Muhammad noticed her and came back after her and struck her on the chest, causing her pain because she had followed him. He said that Gabriel, the angel, had come to him, and that is why he was outside. But as you see here, wives should not behave with unseemliness, and they can be beaten. So in Calgary, in Canada, a new Muslim domestic violence shelter was planned because 40% of the women seeking help were visibly Muslims. And the population at that time in the country was only about 2.5%. So a woman cannot rebel against her husband, and part of that is veiling. So righteous women will be obedient, that if they fear their intractability, they can be warned or hit. And there is the Quran, and that they must not display their beauty as women did in the pre-Islamic period of ignorance. So again, we're talking about that full 18 years before the veil was introduced. It's an enormity. Women's obligatory clothing became very obligatory. They're forbidden to reveal themselves when outside the home on the street. It refers to the entire body. And from the Quran, men are in charge of women, and righteous women are obedient and guarding in their absence what Allah would have them guard, which means veiling and keeping themselves to themselves, and that they could be beaten. So this actually becomes a question of national security in a non-Islamic country. Here we have a former member of parliament in Austria saying, I know myself fathers, when they come home in the evening where they live in the problem area, they give their girls headscarves so they won't be recognized as Austrians because it's unsafe for them to walk in the evening without a veil. So why is that? As you can see in the Quran, tell your wives and daughters and women of the believers to cover themselves so they will be known and not be abused. Cover themselves with veiling sheets so they could return home unrecognized. So women who are not covered are recognized as available for abuse. And in some instances, as you can see here, there are rather terrible results. And this made headlines all around the world that on New Year's Eve in Cologne in 2015, hundreds of women were mobbed and sexually assaulted. And the story says that 511 of the complaints involve sexual assaults. This also happened in Hamburg, Frankfurt, Maine, and Hanover. And the welcoming culture was contradicted in that many people who had previously broadly supported it were suddenly fearful. So this is known and not abused. But the rest of that was not recognized. And you can see that the burqa here covers identity. So thieves wearing burqas stole $120,000 worth of jewels in Australia. And in India, 2 men wearing burqas were arrested for theft. And in Toronto, Canada, burqas worn by robbers, $500,000 in a Toronto jewelry store heist. So what's happening in the schools? This report by Gilbert Sewall, Islam in the Classroom, found that deficiencies in Islam-related lessons are uniquely disturbing, that history textbooks present an incomplete and confected view of Islam that misrepresents its foundations and challenges to international security, that Islamic activists use multiculturalism and ready-made American political movements, especially those on campus, to advance and justify the makeover of Islam-related textbook content. So what's happening in Canada? Again, we have World Hijab Day, and this is in Calgary in 2018. And in 2024, celebrating World Hijab Day, And this is in Vancouver, British Columbia. And of course, marketing has quite a lot to do with this. It's made to look very nice. There are discounts. We have hijab-covered chocolate bars and books. So this book was published in Canada. And it says, after I showed him, the girl's father, the Quranic verses and hadiths of Muhammad, he also realized that our dress code is part of Allah's guidance and the way of Islam. So the stories in Amazon, the reviews say it's a sensitive treatment, respecting cultural differences. And I'm excited to have such a simple, profound story to share with my nieces who want to learn a meaningful lesson about inner strength, faith, and womanhood. That Farah, that's the little girl in the book, enjoyed her private girls' school and fun with her friends and had an assignment to speak about her mother and her hijab on International Women's Day. So I wonder, if there was any mention in this book or maybe in a later book about what the hijab means in places like Afghanistan and Iran. Because here we have International Women's Day in 1979, and this is in Iran. And as you can see, none of these women were wearing hijabs because up until then, they were free to go without a veil, but there was a compulsory hijab ruling. And so this is International Women's Day, women struggling for freedom. And this is what, 45 years ago. And it's an example of what we call the gravity of Muhammad. And that is the tendency for areas to get away from the veiling, from following the doctrine closely, but then to be taken back to it again, because that is the Sharia law. And that's what's happened in Iran here. There was a more secular leader for a while who wanted to modernize and get away from this, but the revolution came and he was replaced by those who closely followed the Sharia. And here's an example of 1966, as you can see the girls in shorts, and in 2016, they're wearing hijabs. And now we move to Pakistan. They're talking about mandatory burqas there as well. And Pakistan is talking about having a hijab day instead of International Women's Day. This was a very interesting interview with the president of Iran's wife on RT, and I recommend watching the video. She spoke about it frequently as being political, the hijab being very political, and she said it always has been, and that it was also a culture and they'd always worn the hijab, which isn't so, and that it was traditional values, morality, law, and of course the police enforce the law, and they do so quite brutally at times. And although Canada does not have compulsory veiling, there is certainly activity in that direction, as you've seen with the hijab days at the schools and the books. And here we have the National Canadian Council of Muslim recommendations in 2021 at a national summit where the hijab is mentioned 9 times. Funding is asked for frequently, and this is for every level of government, the federal, provincial, and municipal. So this is quite political, yes. And it was followed up a year later, looking for accountability. Now, in Iran in 1923, they didn't have compulsory veiling either. And as you can see, these women look quite happy. But what happened in 1979 with women having to wear hijabs after a period of time, women were killed. And as you see here, the death in custody of a woman detained for breaking hijab laws, and it inspired a number of protests in the country. There was another woman who died last year, a very young girl. She was only about 18, and there were enforcers, and some of them are women. And she was knocked into a coma and never recovered. She died. And what the article says is almost a full year after the death of Mahsa Amini in the custody of the morality police, that this hijab and chastity bill was being introduced to intensify punishments so they wouldn't have more of these protests. The bill calls for increased fines and artificial intelligence to identify unveiled women with cameras in public places. 175 members of Iran's parliament voted in favor and 49 against. Well, what about the non-Islamic state? Well, here we have Sweden. A 19-year-old man in Sweden has been charged with abuse after he beat his 14-year-old sister with a baseball bat because she refused to wear an Islamic veil. Because a Sharia can be followed by a country, but it can be followed in a single home as well. And here's another example from the same society as before. This is Canada, Your Voice, Your Future. And there was an article in a medical magazine referring to the hijab as an instrument of oppression. And so this organization immediately launched a letter writing campaign urging the magazine to remove the article and commit to anti-Islamophobia training. And here's the article. So this is the Canadian Medical Association Journal. And the article says, the image of the oppressed veiled Muslim woman has long been used to justify ongoing Western colonialism, and that this is racist. Well, is that really the case? This is around in the 1970s, and you would think a medical journal might be speaking about vitamin D deficiency associated with using the veil. And yes, they did find that there is vitamin D deficiency in women who are veiled. Vitamin D is very necessary for a strong and healthy immune system. So we read earlier about the vote that was being taken to install cameras. Well, it went ahead. They're installing cameras now to punish women for breaking the Muslim dress code. And this is Iran 2023. This woman was beaten last year, or possibly this year. It was very recent. And I won't put the reference here because I don't want to get the woman posting this in trouble. She posts on social media. A lot of this can be found on social media for anybody who searches veiling and Iran or Afghanistan, they'll see. So she was punished with 74 lashes. And after the lashes, she was still refusing to wear the hijab. And a Western woman wrote on that, if only so many more women could do it, would they be able to inflict change on the government? Well, how many women have to endure lashes or be killed to change a law? Sharia law cannot be changed. It is the words of Allah and the example of Muhammad. So this is Afghanistan in the 1950s. As you can see, they were dressed in ordinary street clothing you would expect for the time. And they were in 1972, but Afghan women today are completely shrouded. This is how they play their sports. Here's more examples from Afghanistan. Every day they kidnap girls and torture them for bad hijab. Morality police are spreading fear amongst all the Afghan women. They're being captured on the street. They're being tortured, harassed, and sexually violated for not wearing proper hijabs. Here you see the pretext of a bad hijab, more girls arrested in several of the provinces there. Here are some examples of the beatings for not wearing the approved hijab, and a bad hijab again. As you can see here, a group of young girls arrested with the claim they were not wearing the hijab properly, and nobody knows where they are now. And here are women who we don't know if they are enforcers because they would not dare say anything otherwise. These are women demonstrating in Kabul in support of the Taliban government. We are satisfied with the Islamic attitude and behavior of the Mujahideen, but they're not allowed to protest. Now, as you can see in Saudi Arabia, they're also not allowed to protest. Now, right now, they have a more liberal approach, and the prince is saying that they do not have to, the country is not demanding that they wear hijabs, although their family might. But they have a terrorist law, and it calls for anyone calling into question the fundamentals of the Islamic religion will be considered a terrorist. It's the same in Afghanistan. And for the second time in a month, Saudi has sentenced a woman to decades in prison over her tweets in support of political prisoners. This happens on a regular basis. So enormities in Sharia law are for cross-dressing from masculine type men or effeminate masculine type women or effeminate men. Muhammad cursed them. And here's the hadith where he curses them and says, turn them out of your houses. And in Yemen, the Houthis are executing dozens who are facing LGBTI charges, and they are executed by stoning or crucifixion for homosexuality, spreading immorality, and there are gruesome public spectacles, which is spreading a lot of fear. Purity is important, and it is unbelief, and unbelief is severely punished, to turn away from the Sunnah of Muhammad in order to imitate non-Muslims if one believes their way to be superior. And non-Muslims are described here as impure. And here's an example of what happens. In Canada, this young woman, age 16, she's Ontario, and she chose to wear Western-style clothing and didn't want to cover her hair with a traditional hijab headscarf. And her father and brother killed her. So veiling is obligatory. And we see here in Sharia, the handbook, the nakedness of a woman that she is forbidden to reveal when outside on the street refers to the entire body in the summertime. It's obligatory to provide her with a head covering, and the same in winter. It is unlawful for a man to look at a woman who is not his wife or one of his unmarriageable kin. And it is unlawful for women to leave the house with faces unveiled, whether or not there is a likelihood of temptation. So in Gaza, which has been in the news quite a bit recently, here we have a female Palestinian reporter was beaten by the border patrol in Gaza with a tree branch for not wearing a hijab. So we'll read the story. She was filming at a privately owned farm with her team, and the border patrol came, questioned them, and started focusing on how she dressed, why she's not wearing a hijab. One of them cut off a branch of a lemon tree and struck her 3 times. She had bruises in the lower back and lower part. And she has filed a complaint, but the ministry said that they're not directly responsible for the patrolmen who can basically do what they want in regards to something like this. So I'll finish up with this. This is not in Gaza. This is on TikTok. And as you can see on TikTok, an unlikely call to Islam emerges. Social media influencers make a public display of converting to Islam. It comes intertwined with politics, war, and propaganda, as you've seen in this presentation. So this is something to consider, and hope that young people are hearing all sides of the hijab question and understand that in many places it is compulsory and it is not simply a fashion statement. Thank you very much for your attention. Please like, share, and subscribe. Links are below. Thank you.